From the outside, our family looked like the kind of picture-perfect household you'd see in a magazine or a carefully curated Instagram post. My parents were the kind of people who smiled politely at social gatherings, who gave the impression that everything was calm, orderly, and harmonious. We had what everyone called family traditions: Sunday brunches, holiday dinners, family vacations. But behind the closed doors, the air always carried a weight I couldn't put into words, a subtle tension I felt but couldn't name. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They loved us, I think. But their love had an uneven gravity, pulling more strongly toward my sister. From the time we were children, she seemed to float through life in a bubble of praise and attention. Every good grade she got was celebrated with small ceremonies at home. Every accomplishment became a family triumph. And me? I learned early to shrink into the corners, my successes barely acknowledged, if at all. I remember one winter evening, sitting in the living room after school. I had finally won first place in a local art competition. My hands shook with excitement as I showed my parents the certificate. Their smiles were polite, yes, but fleeting. Within minutes, the conversation shifted to my sister's latest piano recital, her flawless performance lauded and displayed with pride. I sat there, a hollow mix of happiness and humiliation, watching my own triumph dissolve in the shadow of her brilliance. That was the first time I began to understand how invisible I could feel in my own family's eyes. School events, birthdays, simple daily moments. No matter what I did, my sister seemed to dominate the spotlight. Friends would ask about my achievements, and I would share them, only to see the conversation loop back to her. My parents' reactions were subtle but telling, a smile here, a comment there, always measuring the difference between my sister's victories and my own. And slowly, quietly, I began internalizing the idea that my presence mattered less, that my role in the family was to observe rather than participate. Even in casual family photos, the contrast was clear. She stood at the center, shoulders back, smiling with ease. I hovered slightly to the side, careful not to overshadow, careful not to draw attention. I can still feel the twinge of resentment that accompanied the repeated nudges to look happy for your sister. Those words, delivered with gentle insistence, stung more than any harsh criticism could, because they weren't just telling me to be polite, they were reinforcing a hierarchy I had no say in. And yet no one outside our home would ever see it that way. To neighbors, teachers, and family friends, we were the embodiment of harmony. I became an expert at wearing a mask, hiding the quiet ache of exclusion behind a practiced smile. I was the invisible child in a house that celebrated brilliance unevenly, and the world beyond our walls never noticed. The illusion was perfect, and that perfection made the private injustice feel even sharper. Looking back, I can pinpoint the early signs of imbalance, small injustices that seemed inconsequential at the time, a compliment given to her but withheld from me. A parent's favor extended to her whims while my needs were postponed or dismissed. Each moment was minor, almost unnoticeable to the casual observer. But strung together, they created a pattern I couldn't ignore. I began to notice it even in family gatherings, how my sister could bend situations to her advantage, while my own opinions or desires were quietly brushed aside. It was in those quiet, lingering moments of exclusion that I first realized something fundamental. The world inside our home wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Behind the polished surfaces and the curated smiles, there was a current of favoritism, a subtle but persistent injustice that shaped the way we related to each other. And for the first time, I wondered whether I could ever step out of her shadow. Could I ever claim space in a family that seemed to have already decided where each of us belonged? That thought haunted me as I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the muffled laughter of my sister and parents in the next room. The laughter was warm, familiar, but it wasn't mine. I felt a strange mix of longing and frustration, a yearning to belong and a fear that I never would. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet seed of defiance began to take root. Even now, I can see how that first sense of exclusion set the stage for everything that followed. It was Subtle, almost invisible at first, but it shaped my perception of family, fairness, and my own place in the world. And though I didn't understand it then, that seed would grow, slowly, deliberately, until the moment everything changed. The illusion of our perfect family had held for years, but beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. My sisters, constant praise, my parents' selective attention, my own quiet suffering. All of it would collide in ways I could never have predicted. And it all began with those small, almost imperceptible moments. Moments where I learned that family love could feel conditional, that favoritism could define who we were in the eyes of those we trusted most. Little did I know that the first small injustice, the overlooked celebration of my own achievements, was only the beginning. That night, as I lay awake, I didn't just feel left out. I felt the stirrings of a story that would turn everything upside down. The perfect family illusion was about to crack, and my life would never be the same. From my earliest memories, it seemed like the world had decided to shine a brighter light on my sister, leaving me in the shadows. Even as a child, I noticed how effortlessly she drew attention, how her smallest accomplishments were celebrated as if they were monumental achievements. I remember her 6th birthday party vividly. The living room was decorated with colorful balloons, streamers, and a table overflowing with gifts. She beamed with excitement as my parents praised every little thing she did, unwrapping presents, trying to blow out the candles, even taking a bite of her cake. Everyone laughed at her jokes, clapped at her small tricks, and cooed over her every movement. And there I was, sitting quietly in the corner, smiling when expected, feeling invisible. It wasn't just birthdays. Every school performance, every art project, every small victory became her stage. I remember bringing home a drawing I had worked tirelessly on, proud of the colors, the detail, the effort. My parents glanced at it briefly, nodded, and moved on to ask her about her piano recital. She had played only a few notes in front of her music teacher, yet it became a full family celebration. I couldn't understand it then. Why did her small efforts feel monumental while mine seemed invisible? Why did my happiness always have to wait until after hers? Gifts were another battlefield. On holidays, my sister would receive the latest toys, the most elaborate games, and clothing that seemed specially chosen for her, while my presents felt routine, generic, or simply overlooked. It wasn't that my parents didn't care. They loved both of us, but the favoritism was there, quietly persistent, woven into the fabric of our daily lives. I would watch them beam at her achievements, their pride filling the room, and I would swallow my disappointment, forcing a smile that never reached my eyes. School events were particularly painful. During parent-teacher conferences, my sister's grades were always the highlight. Her teachers praised her intelligence, her creativity, her charm. My achievements, if mentioned at all, were couched in polite words, as if they were secondary, unremarkable. And when our families compared us, friends, relatives, neighbors, the contrast became even more glaring. My sister was the example of perfection, and I was the quiet observer, the one who learned to measure myself against her constantly. I think the most difficult part was internalizing the pattern without understanding it fully. I wanted to love her, to admire her like everyone else seemed to, but I couldn't ignore the pangs of resentment that crept into my chest. Even small gestures of hers could trigger a quiet jealousy. I remember a summer afternoon when we were about 7 or 8. She had just learned a new dance for a school recital, and she twirled around the living room, my parents clapping wildly. I had spent the same afternoon trying to master a short piano piece, struggling with the keys, hoping they would notice my effort. But when I tried to show them, my parents only offered brief nods before asking her to perform again. I sank back into the sofa, feeling like I had failed simply by existing in the same space. Over time, the resentment grew. I began to notice the little ways our lives were treated differently, the way her mistakes were excused as learning experiences, while mine were magnified and remembered. The contrast was painful. Admiration for her, neglect for me. I tried to speak up occasionally, to ask for attention or acknowledgement, but my words were brushed aside. "You'll have your turn," they would say, or, She's just a little more advanced right now. Their reassurances felt hollow, like empty promises that never materialized into real change. Family gatherings were another stage where the disparity became impossible to ignore. Relatives would gush over her achievements, recounting stories of her talent, her intelligence, her charm. I would smile politely, my own accomplishments minimized or ignored in the retelling. The subtle hierarchy was everywhere, unspoken but unmistakable. She was the star, and I was the supporting cast, always expected to cheer, never to shine. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. I envied her, yes, but I also felt a strange loyalty to the sister I loved. That made the neglect sting even more. I longed for recognition, for my parents to see me as more than just her brother, to treat my successes with the same enthusiasm they reserved for her. I began to measure my worth in quiet comparison, my self-esteem tethered to how I stacked up against her. Then there was the incident that changed everything. The moment the disparity became undeniable. It was the day of our family's annual summer talent show, a tradition we had followed for years. My sister performed a simple dance routine. My parents clapped loudly, cheered, and recorded every second on camera. When it was my turn to recite a short poem I had written, my voice trembled with nerves, hoping for even a fraction of the excitement she had received. But instead of applause, I received polite nods, a quick smile, and a comment. "That's nice, dear. Good job." Nothing more. Nothing passionate. Nothing celebratory. I felt the sting of invisibility more sharply than ever before. That day, I realized that growing up in her shadow wasn't just about minor annoyances or occasional neglect. It was a pattern, a reality that shaped the way I saw myself and the world. Her victories became my benchmarks. Her attention became the prize. I could never win, and my own efforts felt perpetually secondary. But at the same time, something flickered inside me, a spark of awareness, a quiet determination that maybe, one day, I could claim recognition, respect, and attention for myself. The resentment I felt wasn't loud or angry at first. It was quiet, simmering beneath the surface, shaping the way I moved through our family life. I learned to notice the injustices, to catalog the small slights, and to compare my experiences with hers. And though it was painful, it was also the beginning of understanding a pattern I would later confront, the first step toward finding a voice that had been ignored for far too long. By the time I was a preteen, the shadow had grown larger, and so had my awareness of it. I could feel the imbalance in almost everything: gifts, praise, attention, even the smallest moments of affection. The realization that favoritism could define the way a family functions was both terrifying and clarifying. And that fear, combined with the desire for recognition, laid the foundation for the events that would eventually force the family to confront its own imperfect illusions. It was in that summer talent show, that one glaring moment of dismissal, that I understood just how deep the shadow ran. The favoritism was no longer subtle, it was visible, undeniable, and crushing. And in that realization, the first seed of change began to take root. A seed that would grow slowly, quietly, and then erupt in ways I could never have imagined. I still remember the day of my first real betrayal as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was one of those moments that start small but hit with a force that leaves a mark on your memory. I had been preparing for weeks to compete in the citywide science fair. My project, a small model demonstrating renewable energy, was something I had built from scratch, staying up late into the evenings, meticulously assembling circuits, writing explanations, and rehearsing my presentation. I was proud, maybe more proud than I had ever been of anything. I told my parents countless times about the work I was putting in, sharing each step as if letting them in on a secret world that I had created. I was promised, repeatedly, that they would come. "We'll be there for you," my mother had said, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder, eyes warm with that comforting expression parents often use to reassure their children. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," my father added, nodding, the kind of promise that should have been unbreakable. I believed them. I believed that for once, all the hours of hard work, All the moments of quiet frustration and exhaustion would be acknowledged and celebrated. The morning of the fair arrived, and I woke early, buzzing with nervous excitement. I carefully packed my project into the car, triple-checking to make sure everything was secure. My backpack contained my notes, my calculations, even a little reward I had planned for myself, an extra chocolate bar I had been saving for weeks. I was ready. I was confident. I was brimming with anticipation for the moment I would finally step out of the shadow and be seen. And then, I realized they weren't coming. At first I thought it was a misunderstanding, a scheduling error, maybe traffic, maybe work emergencies. I called, my voice cracking with a mix of confusion and rising panic. My father's voice came through, casual, distracted. "We just can't make it today. There's something important at work." Mother added almost apologetically, "We'll watch a video, maybe take some pictures next time. You'll understand." But I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. I felt like someone had pulled the floor from under me, leaving me, suspended in midair, my accomplishments meaningless. I tried to tell myself it wasn't about me. Maybe they were genuinely busy. Maybe it wasn't intentional. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't the first time my achievements had been overlooked, and it wouldn't be the last. The sting of favoritism I had learned to accept quietly suddenly became a sharp, undeniable pain. My sister had her own competition that week, a small recital at her music school. I heard her practicing the day before, my parents clapping along enthusiastically. And now, when my moment had arrived, the same enthusiasm was gone, replaced by convenient excuses. Arriving at the fair, I carried my project to the display tables with hands that trembled, not from nerves, but from a strange mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. Other kids' parents were bustling around, taking photos, offering encouragement, chatting with teachers and judges. I stood there, invisible in a crowd of attention, my own family absent, leaving me exposed in a way I had never experienced. The contrast was unbearable. Where my sister had always had a cheering section, I was left with silence. The judges were kind, their feedback constructive, but it didn't matter. Without my parents' presence, without their recognition, the moment felt hollow. My success, my effort, my long nights of work, none of it seemed to matter. I walked home that evening, carrying the heavy box of my project, my stomach twisting with disappointment. I barely spoke on the drive, staring out the window at passing trees, my sister chattering in the back seat about her own accomplishments. That week, I forced a polite smile, nodded along, but inside I was simmering. That betrayal wasn't just about missing a science fair. It was the crystallization of a pattern I had felt for years, the constant prioritization of my sister, the subtle dismissal of my own achievements, the quiet reinforcement that my place in the family hierarchy was secondary. I remember sitting alone in my room that night, my project laid carefully on my desk, feeling a mix of sorrow and a strange, newfound determination. I didn't want to hate my parents. I still loved them, of course. But I could no longer ignore the imbalance. I could no longer pretend that their actions, or inactions, didn't matter. From that day on, I started noticing things more consciously. It wasn't just birthdays or school events anymore. It was every small interaction, every glance, every word. The pattern was unmistakable. Compliments for my sister were exuberant, effusive, heartfelt. Compliments for me were polite, fleeting, almost obligatory. Decisions about where to spend family time always favored her, whether it was attending recitals, buying gifts, or simply choosing who to praise at dinner. The betrayal at the science fair had opened my eyes. I had been living in a household of subtle favoritism, and now I understood it fully. That night, staring at the ceiling, I made a quiet promise to myself. I couldn't control my parents' actions or their biases. I couldn't make them see my value if they refused, but I could control how I responded. I could start cataloging these injustices, understanding the ways I had been overlooked, and preparing for a moment when my worth would no longer be ignored. It was the first spark of self-awareness, the first seed of what would eventually grow into determination. And though I didn't know it at the time, that betrayal, so small to anyone else, so devastating to me, was the moment my journey began. From that day on, I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. I was learning to see the inequality, to feel it consciously, and to recognize that my voice, my achievements, my presence deserved more than polite acknowledgement. That realization would guide every choice I made moving forward, every step I took toward the day when the balance would finally shift. For years, I became an expert at hiding the storm inside me. On the surface, I smiled, I laughed, I participated in family dinners and gatherings as if everything were perfectly fine. But inside, there was a quiet ache, a gnawing emptiness that no compliment or acknowledgement could fill. I learned to master the art of invisibility, not out of shame, but out of necessity. My sister's every success was celebrated, loudly, enthusiastically, and I learned that drawing attention to myself only complicated things. So, I stayed quiet, endured, and swallowed the frustration that constantly bubbled beneath the surface. It wasn't easy. Each family interaction became a minefield of subtle slights, unspoken hierarchies, and invisible rules. Compliments that went to her were carefully observed and mentally logged. Recognition that came my way felt fleeting, almost accidental, and it never erased the memory of being overlooked. Sometimes I would catch myself holding back tears in the kitchen, standing at the sink washing dishes while my parents fussed over her accomplishments in the next room. I remember gripping the edges of the counter until my knuckles turned white, feeling a mix of helplessness, anger, and yearning for some small piece of validation. School became a refuge in some ways, but even there, the shadow followed me. I was capable, intelligent, creative, but always in her shadow. At home, my talents were minimized. At school, I tried to make them visible. Yet I carried the internalized voice of favoritism with me, a whisper that no matter what I did, it would never be enough in the eyes of those who mattered most. That whisper grew louder over time, echoing in my mind during quiet moments, gnawing at my self-esteem. It was a subtle psychological toll, one I carried silently, never speaking about it for fear of being labeled ungrateful or jealous. I learned to wear a mask. When friends or extended family visited, I smiled, laughed at jokes, participated enthusiastically in conversations, all while my chest tightened with quiet frustration. I became adept at pretending that everything was fine, because admitting the truth, admitting the hurt, felt dangerous. It might provoke anger, dismissal, or worse, further invisibility. So I endured. I internalized. I told myself that this was just the way things were, that this was how families operated, that someday maybe things would change. Even in my personal life, the shadow loomed. Hobbies I loved were pursued quietly, without the expectation of applause. If I played the piano, I played softly, knowing the household's attention would drift to my sister's newer, more visible achievements. If I wrote stories or sketches, I did so in notebooks hidden beneath my bed, afraid that bringing them to light would only invite comparison or disappointment. My creativity became a private sanctuary, a small rebellion against the constant erasure I felt at home. There were moments, of course, when I briefly tested boundaries. I would offer a subtle correction, a quiet suggestion, or a carefully worded comment only to have it brushed aside or ignored. The sting of invisibility was sharp in those moments. My words, my thoughts, my presence, treated as though they barely existed, and yet these small failures began to shape a new understanding. Perhaps the path forward wasn't demanding recognition from others, but learning to assert it myself in ways they couldn't control. The psychological toll was insidious. Nights were often the hardest. Lying in bed, listening to the muffled laughter and chatter of my family in the living room, I would replay the day's small humiliations and slights, the unacknowledged efforts, the overlooked achievements, the constant comparison. It all accumulated like weight pressing down on my chest. At times I would stare at the ceiling, wishing for some escape, some validation that felt increasingly out of reach. It was during these solitary moments that resentment quietly coiled within me, not as anger toward my sister, but as awareness of the systemic unfairness I had been forced to endure. And yet, there was also a resilience forming. In the silence, in the private ache, I began noticing my own strength. Enduring favoritism, learning to remain composed in the face of injustice, maintaining dignity while being overlooked, it was teaching me patience, strategic observation, and self-control. The pain was real, yes, but it was also molding me, slowly, into someone who could survive and eventually reclaim the recognition I deserved. I also began testing subtle forms of rebellion, small acts, almost imperceptible, but deeply satisfying. I would leave my artwork in a visible corner of the house, quietly daring my parents to notice. I would complete chores with a touch more flair than necessary, hoping they might acknowledge the effort. Sometimes I would intentionally outperform my sister in minor tasks, savoring the private satisfaction of having done something well, even if no one else saw it. These acts were tiny sparks, but they marked the beginning of a shift in my mindset. I was learning that assertion didn't always need validation from others to be meaningful. It was during this period of silent suffering that I began cataloging the injustices in my mind. Each overlooked success, each compliment reserved for my sister, each subtle exclusion became a data point, a map of favoritism I could analyze. I realized that the world inside my home wasn't just uneven, it was predictable. And predictability, I discovered, was power. If I understood the patterns, I could anticipate the slights, navigate them, and begin planting the seeds of change. By the time I reached early adolescence, the silent suffering had become a familiar companion. I understood the rules of invisibility, of endurance, of careful observation. But the spark of quiet rebellion had grown alongside it. I had learned to recognize my worth internally, even when external recognition was denied. I began to dream of a moment when the patterns could be disrupted, when the hierarchy of favoritism could be challenged, when I could finally emerge from the shadows. Those years of quiet endurance shaped me in ways I wouldn't have understood at the time. They taught me to observe, to calculate, to wait patiently, and to find satisfaction in small private victories. And as subtle acts of assertion began to appear, the first glimmers of empowerment started to pierce the shadow that had enveloped my youth. I didn't yet know how or when, but I felt the stirrings of change. The quiet suffering was not an endpoint. It was the foundation for the rebellion that would eventually redefine my place in the family. There was a rhythm to our household that became painfully predictable over the years. Every time my sister succeeded, the entire family shifted, almost instinctively, to celebrate her brilliance. And I learned quietly to step aside and watch. Her achievements were like signals, fireworks that everyone could see and admire, while mine were whispers, easily drowned out by the thunder of her praise. I remember one autumn evening when she won first place in a statewide essay competition. The moment her name was announced, my parents were beaming, hugging her tightly, their voices almost vibrating with excitement. I had been working on a science project at the same time, something I had spent weeks perfecting, but the acknowledgement I received was limited to a passing nod and a quick, "That's nice too." I felt the sting acutely, the contrast between her triumph and my relative invisibility. Even my own pride in the project felt diminished, eclipsed by the spectacle of her recognition. Her social successes were just as glaring. At school, she had an effortless charisma, a way of drawing people in that I struggled to understand. She made friends quickly, earned the admiration of teachers, and became a figure that everyone wanted to impress. I, on the other hand, moved through the same corridors quietly, careful not to draw attention, careful to avoid conflict, careful to exist in a way that wouldn't disrupt the delicate balance of attention that seemed permanently tilted in her favor. I envied the ease with which she navigated the world, envied the way she seemed to belong effortlessly wherever she went. Family approval was another arena, where her victories loomed large. Whether it was a school award, a well-timed compliment, or simply showing kindness at the right moment, she received accolades that I could only dream of. Even small gestures of talent or intelligence, knowing the right answer, reciting a poem perfectly, mastering a difficult skill, became reasons for family-wide celebrations. I would watch, sometimes sitting close enough to hear their laughter and excitement and feel a mix of admiration, frustration, and isolation. The disparity was constant, unrelenting, a shadow that followed me through my formative years. I remember the moment that struck me most vividly. It was during my sister's first major piano recital, held at a local auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and peers. She played flawlessly, the notes cascading effortlessly from the piano. My parents clapped, their faces shining with pride, capturing every second on camera. When it was my turn to perform a solo I had been practicing for weeks on my violin, I noticed the polite, restrained applause. There was warmth, yes, but it lacked the intensity and excitement reserved for her. I felt small, almost invisible, despite knowing I had done well. That day, the contrast between her triumph and my overlooked efforts was impossible to ignore. Her successes extended beyond tangible achievements. She had a way of knowing exactly what to say and how to act to earn praise, a social intelligence I lacked. Compliments flowed naturally to her, reinforcing her position as the favored child. Every smile directed her way, every encouraging word from my parents, every gesture of admiration from relatives, it all piled up, a mountain of recognition that seemed impossible to reach. I felt the weight of my own invisibility pressing down, harder with each success she achieved. But these moments also built empathy, in ways that were subtle yet powerful. Watching her succeed, I understood her struggles too. She worked hard, certainly, and her victories were not undeserved. There were late nights, missed playtimes, and moments of stress and self-doubt that no one outside our family ever saw. And, yet, the recognition she received contrasted with my overlooked efforts, carved a deep sense of injustice into my psyche. I began to understand not only the world's inequalities but the family's, and the impact it had on self-worth, on confidence, on identity. Despite the pain, I also began learning from her. I observed her carefully, how she spoke to our parents, how she navigated social situations, how she presented her accomplishments in a way that commanded attention. These observations became a quiet education, a roadmap of sorts, showing me what it took to earn recognition and favor. I started to notice patterns in behavior, subtleties in family dynamics that I had previously overlooked. There was a strategy, even if it was unconscious, in how she moved through life. And slowly, I began to absorb those lessons, even as my resentment simmered quietly alongside admiration. It was during these years, surrounded by her continuous stream of triumphs, that a subtle shift began to emerge inside me. I started to recognize that my own invisibility wasn't permanent. I could see the pathways she took to achieve attention and approval, and I began imagining ways I might carve out space for myself. The seed of change, small and tentative, was planted in the fertile soil of quiet observation and internalized frustration. I realized that the contrast between her success and my overlooked efforts wasn't just painful. It was a signal, a reminder that change was possible if I acted strategically. Her victories were both a mirror and a motivator, reflecting the gaps in recognition that I needed to address, and inspiring the first flickers of determination to claim the acknowledgement I had long been denied. And though I still had years of silent suffering ahead of me, these moments of watching her triumph were also moments of learning. Every accolade she received, every smile and gesture from my parents, every subtle favor that tipped the scales in her direction, became evidence of the system I would one day navigate and, eventually, challenge. By the time I entered my teenage years, I could see it clearly. The pattern of favoritism, the consistent admiration she received, and the ways I had been overlooked were not random. They were systemic. And that awareness, painful as it was, began to empower me. The stage was being set, subtly, for a turning point, for a day when the balance would shift, when the quiet resentment and observation would give way to deliberate action, and when the shadow I had grown up under would finally be challenged. Watching her rise, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride, envy, admiration, and frustration. It was a complicated, bittersweet feeling, but one thing became certain: I could no longer remain invisible. The contrast between her brilliance and my obscurity had ignited a spark that would shape the next chapter of my life, guiding me toward recognition, self-assertion, and eventually the moment everything would change. I had been holding it all in for years, swallowing the quiet ache of being invisible, the sting of favoritism, the constant comparison to my sister. But there comes a moment when patience snaps, when humiliation builds so high that it can no longer be contained. For me, that moment arrived one chilly winter evening, the kind where the wind howls against the windows and the house feels smaller than it should. I had just returned from a regional science competition. After weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and relentless effort, I had come home with a respectable placement, third place out of dozens of participants. It wasn't first, not a gold medal, but it was a huge accomplishment for me. I expected my parents to notice even just briefly, to ask questions, to show a flicker of pride. Instead, as I walked in, the first words I heard were my sister's, loudly announcing to the room that she had received a perfect score on her latest piano exam. My parents immediately shifted attention to her. Compliments flowed, laughter erupted, cameras clicked, and there I stood, holding my certificate, my hands trembling, a lump forming in my throat. I tried to speak, to share my news. I placed third, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother gave a faint nod, but her eyes never left my sister. My father mumbled something about being good for you, but it sounded distant, distracted. The words meant little, if anything. The warmth, the recognition I craved was gone, replaced by indifference. The humiliation sank deep. I had hoped, naively perhaps, that my effort would earn even a fraction of the celebration she received. Instead, I felt small, unimportant, like my achievement was invisible. My sister, oblivious to my struggle, continued recounting her perfect score, the way her fingers had danced over the piano keys, the praise she had received from her teacher. I forced a smile, clapping and nodding along, but inside, anger and hurt mingled into a bitter cocktail. The night didn't get any better. At dinner, our extended family arrived, and the conversation predictably revolved around her. "She's so talented," one uncle said. "You must be so proud," my grandmother added. Every comment about her success was another reminder of how insignificant my own accomplishments seemed. I felt trapped, a spectator in my own life, forced to witness the celebration of someone else's brilliance while my own efforts were brushed aside. I excused myself after dinner, retreating to my room, the door shut behind me, a barrier between the world that ignored me and the one I desperately wanted to enter. I sank onto my bed, staring at the certificate in my hands, feeling the weight of my own invisibility pressing down. The humiliation of the evening burned hotter than anything I had experienced before. I was angry, not just at my parents, not just at my sister, but at the situation itself, the unfairness, the favoritism, the endless pattern that had defined my life up to this point. In the quiet of my room, I replayed every slight, every overlooked effort, every moment of being pushed into the shadows. The years of silent suffering, the patience, the endurance, it all felt wasted. But amid the anger and humiliation, something else began to emerge, a seed of desire for justice. I realized that waiting for recognition from my parents, hoping for fairness or validation, was no longer enough. If I wanted to be seen, if I wanted my efforts to matter, I would have to find a way to claim it for myself. The humiliation of that evening transformed into a simmering determination. I started thinking almost obsessively about all the ways I had been ignored, about the patterns of favoritism I had endured. I cataloged the moments: birthdays, school events, family gatherings, casual compliments, subtle dismissals. Each one became evidence, a map of inequality that I could analyze, study, and eventually counteract. The anger wasn't just emotion, it was fuel, energy I could channel into action. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The warmth and celebration that my sister enjoyed had always been out of my reach, but now I could feel a spark, a flicker of rebellion, of self-assertion. I began imagining the day when the balance would shift, when my voice would no longer be ignored, when my efforts would finally be acknowledged. The humiliation that had once crushed me was slowly being transformed into resolve. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. The seed of desire for justice grew quietly at first. Nurtured by observation and reflection, I started noticing everything more acutely. The way my sister's actions were rewarded, the ways my parents overlooked my presence, the subtle hierarchies that dictated who mattered most. And as awareness sharpened, so did my understanding. That change would require strategy, patience, and perhaps even a degree of cunning I hadn't possessed before. From that breaking point, I learned the first critical lesson. Invisibility was not permanent. I could no longer wait for others to acknowledge me. I had to learn to assert myself, to claim space, to create moments of recognition that could not be ignored. The humiliation I had endured was no longer just a wound. It was a signal, a guide pointing toward the path I would have to take to alter the dynamics that had defined my life for so long. The anger and isolation I felt that night were intense, almost suffocating, but they were also clarifying. I understood something I had only sensed before: my family's favoritism, the constant overshadowing, the systemic imbalance. It was not my fault, but it was my reality. And reality, I realized, could be challenged. The first break in patience had sparked something more powerful than resentment. It had ignited the first real fire of determination. The desire to no longer be invisible, the urge to be recognized for who I truly was. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the certificate resting beside me, I made a silent vow. I would no longer allow the world, or my family, to define my worth. The pain, the humiliation, the long years of quiet suffering, they would not break me. They would become the foundation for the person I was beginning to understand I could become. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought lingered, thrilling and terrifying. The day would come when the balance would shift, when the shadow I had lived under for so long would finally be illuminated by my own light. After that breaking point, something inside me shifted. The humiliation and anger I had felt didn't disappear. Instead, they transformed into a quiet, almost clinical curiosity. I stopped merely enduring the favoritism and began to study it, like a scientist observing a phenomenon I could neither ignore nor escape. For the first time, I was no longer just a passive participant in my family's dynamic. I became an observer, a student of patterns, a strategist in my own life. I started paying close attention to my sister's interactions. She had a remarkable ability to anticipate reactions, to navigate social dynamics with almost instinctive precision. She knew exactly when to smile, when to laugh, when to tilt her head in just the right way to elicit praise. I noticed how my parents leaned toward her words, how their expressions softened when she spoke, and how every small success of hers became a reason for celebration. I cataloged each moment meticulously in my mind, the timing, the phrasing, the gestures. Slowly, I began to understand that her brilliance wasn't only in her talent but also in her mastery of influence. My parents' biases became equally visible. I noticed how they celebrated her accomplishments more elaborately, how they excused her mistakes while noting mine. Even trivial details, like the way they served her favorite foods first, or praised her organizational skills, revealed the subtle architecture of favoritism. I began to see that the disparity wasn't random. It was structured, predictable, and navigable if I could learn the rules. I had spent years feeling invisible, but now I realized that invisibility could be challenged with knowledge and patience. At first, observation felt almost therapeutic. Instead of reacting emotionally, I recorded everything internally, letting my awareness sharpen. I started recognizing the exact triggers that prompted parental approval and the cues my sister used to command attention. I watched the way she interacted with relatives, teachers, and even friends, seeing patterns that I could analyze and eventually use to my advantage. I became a silent strategist, learning without overt confrontation, biding my time while my understanding deepened. This period of observation was also an exercise in patience. I had previously been frustrated, consumed by anger and humiliation, yet now I was practicing restraint. I resisted the urge to confront my sister or demand recognition from my parents. Instead, I cultivated a quiet attentiveness, noting when favors were granted, when praise was withheld, and when I could potentially step in to shift the balance. Each observation reinforced a new sense of agency. I might have been powerless in the past, but I could no longer claim ignorance as an excuse. Knowledge was power, and I was gathering it meticulously. I also began noticing my own responses more clearly. My feelings of envy and resentment didn't vanish, but I learned to channel them into curiosity rather than despair. Instead of lashing out or withdrawing, I questioned, why do they respond this way? What triggers the praise she receives? What patterns could I exploit to assert my own presence? This self-reflection became an essential tool, allowing me to see the dynamics with clarity rather than letting them consume me emotionally. Small insights began to emerge. I noticed that my sister's timing was impeccable. She never revealed accomplishments too early or too late, always when my parents were most attentive. I realized that certain phrases, gestures, and behaviors consistently elicited positive reinforcement from them. Conversely, my attempts at recognition often coincided with distractions, fatigue, or circumstances where attention was divided. I cataloged these patterns carefully, building a mental map of influence and approval within the household. Curiosity grew into strategy. I began experimenting subtly, testing how small changes in my behavior could alter the reactions of my parents. Sometimes I repeated the phrasing my sister used, mimicking her confidence in a controlled way. Other times I highlighted my accomplishments indirectly, letting my actions speak rather than demanding attention. Each experiment was a lesson, every reaction a data point. The power of quiet observation became increasingly evident. I could no longer rely on chance, but I could act with precision. The contrast between this new approach and my earlier helplessness was stark. Where once I had been reactive, angry, or withdrawn, I was now calculated, patient, and analytical. I realized that endurance alone had been insufficient. Recognition required understanding, timing, and subtle assertion. This insight sparked a quiet sense of hope. Perhaps change wasn't just possible, it was achievable, if approached strategically. Even my emotional responses began to transform. The anger and humiliation that had defined previous years were now tempered by curiosity and intent. I understood that my feelings could be a tool rather than a burden, guiding my observations and shaping my approach to interactions with my sister and parents. I felt a growing sense of control, the realization that I could influence my circumstances rather than being permanently defined by them. By the end of that year, the quiet observation had become a skill, almost instinctual. I could anticipate moments of favoritism before they occurred, predict my sister's moves, and recognize when and how to step forward for acknowledgement. Each day, I felt a growing sense of empowerment, an understanding that I was no longer entirely at the mercy of their biases. I had learned to read the room, understand the players, and quietly plan for my own emergence. And somewhere beneath the surface, the first inklings of action began to form. Observation alone wasn't enough. I knew that at some point I would need to move from watching to doing, from enduring to asserting. But that transition had to be carefully timed, deliberate, and precise. For now, the act of quiet observation allowed me to reclaim a sense of agency, to shift from helplessness to strategy, and to imagine the possibility of change. By the time I reflected on these years, I realized that this period of silent study had been transformative. The humiliation and exclusion I had suffered were still real, still painful, but they were no longer defining me. Instead, they were providing the knowledge, perspective, and patience I would need to create the change I longed for. The seed of empowerment had been planted, and now it was nurtured by insight, curiosity, and a calculated resolve that would guide my next steps. I had learned to watch, to catalog, to understand. And in doing so, I glimpsed a future where recognition was not just possible but inevitable. The patterns of favoritism were no longer insurmountable obstacles. They were maps, guides to navigate and eventually rewrite the rules of my own life. Change was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach, and the quiet observation that had once been a survival tactic had now become my first real tool of transformation. After months of quiet observation and careful analysis, I finally felt a surge of courage. I had cataloged patterns, anticipated reactions, and understood the subtle manipulations that govern my family's dynamics. The seed of empowerment that had been quietly growing now demanded action. I decided it was time to try, to assert myself, to step out of the shadows, to claim a sliver of recognition that had been denied for years. It started one evening at the dinner table. My sister had just recounted a small achievement, a school award she had received for her art project, and my parents were predictably lavishing praise on her. I felt a tightening in my chest, a familiar mix of resentment and longing, but this time, I refused to retreat. Taking a deep breath, I decided to speak up. I wanted to share something too, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I finished my project at school, and I got an A. The response I received was not what I had imagined. My sister barely looked up, absorbed in her own triumph, while my parents' reactions were lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," my mother said, her tone polite but distracted, before returning her attention to my sister. My father nodded, murmured something brief, and then the conversation moved on without hesitation. The dismissal was subtle, almost polite, but it hit harder than any harsh words could have. My attempt at asserting myself had been invalidated instantly, swept aside by the gravitational pull of favoritism that dominated the household. I felt a mix of humiliation and frustration, but I didn't let it show immediately. Instead, I pushed further, trying to add details to make my achievement more visible. "I also helped organize the group project and wrote most of the report," I said, hoping that context might change their reaction. But even then, the acknowledgement was minimal, a nod, a soft, "good job." And then the subject returned to my sister's accomplishments. It was as if my words were absorbed into the air, noticed, but not valued. The evening ended with the usual rhythm, my sister basking in attention, my parents focused on her, and me retreating inwardly. I went to my room later, staring at the ceiling, replaying the interaction over and over. The failure to assert myself wasn't due to lack of effort. It was the systemic bias, the entrenched favoritism that I had begun to understand so well. My heart ached with frustration, but beneath it, another feeling began to grow: determination. If a single attempt had failed, it wasn't the end. It was a signal that I needed a better approach, a more strategic plan. Over the next few days, I reflected deeply on the attempt. I realized that speaking up alone wasn't enough. My words were drowned out by patterns I had long observed: the timing, the energy, the subtle ways my parents' attention shifted. I understood that asserting myself required more than courage. It required strategy, precision, and timing. I couldn't rely on impulsive declarations. I needed calculated moves that could not be ignored. I began experimenting with smaller acts of assertion. In class, I volunteered for leadership roles, showcasing competence in ways that were undeniable. At home, I found moments where I could quietly demonstrate value, helping with chores more efficiently, completing tasks that others overlooked, subtly highlighting my contributions without demanding acknowledgement. Each small success was a test, a way to learn how to navigate the family dynamic more effectively. Yet the sting of the initial failure remained. I had tasted a moment of empowerment and had it snatched away almost immediately. That contrast, the brief sense of agency versus the harsh reality of systemic injustice, was both painful and illuminating. I understood that recognition wasn't given freely in my family. It had to be claimed, earned, and sometimes engineered, through persistence and strategy. This first attempt at standing up also taught me about resilience. I realized that failure didn't mean defeat. It meant learning. Each dismissal, each moment of being overshadowed, became data for my evolving strategy. I cataloged reactions, noted patterns of attention, and refined my approach. The humiliation I had felt transformed into insight, fueling a desire not just to be noticed, but to be respected and validated in ways that could not be ignored. One afternoon, I tried another approach. During a family discussion about weekend, Plans, I subtly reminded my parents of my contributions to a recent community project. Remember, I helped set up the fundraiser at school, I said casually. My parents acknowledged me briefly, but the attention quickly reverted to my sister, who had prepared a bake sale for her art class. The repetition of this pattern reinforced the lesson. The system of favoritism was resilient, but not immutable. Change would require patience, observation, and carefully orchestrated action. By the end of that week, I understood a crucial truth. Standing up was not just about voice, it was about timing, visibility, and impact. My courage had been real, but my strategy had been incomplete. I was beginning to grasp the complexity of the household dynamics in a way I never had before. Recognition wasn't a matter of luck. It was a skill, a game of subtle influence, timing, and persistence. That realization shifted my mindset. I wasn't defeated, I was preparing. The first attempt had failed, yes, but it had also illuminated the path forward. I learned to read the room, anticipate reactions, and plan my moves with the precision of a chess player. The empowerment I sought wouldn't be handed to me, but I had glimpsed the possibility, and that glimpse was enough to spark determination. And so, the first failed attempt at standing up became a turning point. It showed me the stark contrast between my desire for recognition and the reality of systemic injustice, but it also revealed the tools I would need to eventually claim the acknowledgement I deserved. The humiliation was painful, the dismissal stung, but the lesson was invaluable. I couldn't rely on others to see my worth. I had to create my own path, one calculated step at a time, toward a future where my presence could no longer be ignored. For years, I had navigated the household, alone, a silent observer of favoritism and dismissal, a ghost in my own family's story. My attempts to assert myself had met resistance or polite indifference, leaving me exhausted, frustrated, and at times, almost ready to surrender. But life, in its subtle and unpredictable way, sometimes offers a hand just when you need it most. That hand came in the form of an unexpected ally, someone who noticed the imbalance, saw the pain that had long been hidden, and offered guidance in a way that neither judgment nor pity could replicate. It was during my sophomore year of high school, a time when the pressure of familial favoritism was particularly acute. My sister had just been accepted into a prestigious summer program for young artists, and the celebration that followed was, predictably, overwhelming. My parents were ecstatic, fussing over her plans, her travel arrangements, the accolades she had earned. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, stirring my tea, pretending to be absorbed in a book while my chest tightened with familiar frustration and isolation. That's when my aunt arrived. She was my father's sister, a woman I had always admired from a distance, sharp, perceptive, and unafraid to speak truth when others hesitated. She had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, and when she looked at me that evening, it felt like she was peering straight through the layers of silence and pretense I had cultivated for years. "I see you," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she smiled, a warm, knowing smile, the kind that doesn't need explanation. "You're doing remarkable things, even if everyone else doesn't notice." Her words were a shock. I had spent so long assuming that my parents' favoritism was the only lens through which my achievements could be validated. To hear someone acknowledge my efforts without judgment or comparison was like a sudden beam of sunlight piercing a long, dark tunnel. I felt a surge of hope, mixed with disbelief. Could it really be that someone outside the immediate family saw what I had been doing all along? Over the next few weeks, she began offering guidance, gently at first, then with increasing clarity. We spent afternoons together, talking through the dynamics of my household, analyzing patterns of favoritism and manipulation, and developing strategies for asserting myself without provoking confrontation. She taught me that visibility wasn't about shouting the loudest or demanding attention. It was about positioning, timing, and understanding the emotional landscape of those around me. I learned to frame my achievements in ways that couldn't be dismissed. She explained the psychology of attention, how small gestures could be amplified to command acknowledgement, and how subtle shifts in presentation could alter perceptions. We discussed ways to navigate conversations with my sister, how to anticipate her moves, and how to claim space without inciting defensiveness from my parents. Each lesson was a revelation, a toolkit for reclaiming my voice and power in a household that had long denied me both. The contrast between my prior isolation and this newfound support was stark. For years, I had felt utterly alone in my struggle, carrying the weight of favoritism silently and internally. Now, with her guidance, the burden felt lighter. I realized that I didn't have to navigate the system entirely by myself, that insight, perspective, and mentorship could be allies, as powerful as any personal effort. It was as if a missing piece of the puzzle had been handed to me, and suddenly the path forward seemed less like a blind march and more like a calculated journey toward empowerment. Her mentorship also validated my feelings in a profound way. She didn't belittle my frustration or suggest that I was overreacting. She simply confirmed what I already knew intuitively, that my exclusion was real, my achievements had been overlooked, and the patterns of favoritism were deeply ingrained. The validation itself was transformative. No longer did I feel that my observations were paranoia or that my resentment was misplaced. It was real, and now I had guidance on how to respond effectively. Together, we devised small exercises to build my confidence and assertiveness. I practiced speaking about my achievements with clarity and precision, learning to highlight the value of my contributions without sounding boastful. I learned to anticipate familial reactions and prepare responses that would subtly shift attention in my favor. Each practice session, each strategy discussed, felt like a step out of the shadows I had inhabited for so long. Perhaps most importantly, she taught me patience. Recognition and empowerment were not instantaneous. They were cultivated over time, through repeated, deliberate actions. I realized that small, calculated moves could accumulate into meaningful change, slowly but surely altering the dynamics that had long defined my place in the family. The concept of incremental victories, carefully executed, was revolutionary to me. It gave structure to what had previously felt like an endless cycle of invisibility. Her support also helped me reframe the emotional landscape of my experiences. I began to see past pain and humiliation, not as endpoints, but as lessons and fuel. The injustice I had endured became data for strategy. The favoritism I had suffered became a map for navigation. And the shadow I had grown up under became a guide for timing my emergence. Hope and empowerment began to intertwine with the old feelings of pain and frustration, creating a complex, motivating mixture that energized my next steps. By the end of that year, I had transformed from a silent observer to a strategic participant. I no longer relied on luck or the goodwill of my parents. I had tools, mentorship, and a growing understanding of how to assert my presence meaningfully. The isolation that had defined my life was no longer total. I had an ally who could guide me, challenge me, and help me see that change was not only possible, it was achievable. Looking back, I recognized that her guidance marked the beginning of a turning point. The combination of insight, strategy, and emotional support gave me the first real hope that my voice could be heard, my efforts recognized, and my presence valued. The contrast between the years of isolation and the emergence of this mentorship could not have been clearer, and it set the stage for the deliberate, calculated actions that would define the next phase of my journey. I left that year with a renewed sense of purpose. The imbalance I had endured for so long was no longer insurmountable. It was a challenge I could confront with knowledge, strategy, and support, and though the past pain still lingered, it was now intertwined with hope. A hope that for the first time felt tangible, actionable, and within my control. The ally's presence had transformed my perspective, and with it, the quiet, patient work of reclaiming my voice and power truly began. After months of careful observation, strategy, and guidance from my aunt, I began to notice the first signs of change. It started subtly, small shifts in how people reacted to me, quiet acknowledgments that had previously been denied. These minor victories didn't make the headlines at home, but to me, they were monumental. Every recognition, no matter how small, felt like a crack in the wall of favoritism that had long defined my family's dynamics. The first real triumph came at school. I had entered a regional debate competition, something I had avoided in the past because I feared being overlooked, overshadowed by more charismatic participants, or failing to command attention. But this time was different. I applied everything I had learned, timing my arguments, modulating my voice, asserting my points with calm confidence. When the judges announced that I had placed first, the pride I felt was overwhelming. For the first time, the result of my effort was undeniable. Even my teacher, who had seen me as quiet and reserved for years, offered enthusiastic congratulations. I felt a surge of validation that had nothing to do with favoritism and everything to do with my own skill and preparation. I brought the news home cautiously, unsure how my family would react. My parents acknowledged my success with polite smiles, but the energy was muted compared to their usual reactions to my sister. Still, it was a recognition that mattered more to me than the loud celebrations of the past. I had claimed a small victory, and it was mine entirely. I could feel my confidence growing, a quiet empowerment taking root. These victories began to accumulate. At school, I earned recognition for volunteer work, contributed meaningfully to group projects, and slowly started to be seen as someone capable and reliable. Each acknowledgement was a piece of armor, protecting me from the sting of past invisibility. At home, I experimented with subtle visibility, completing household tasks efficiently, taking initiative in ways that couldn't be ignored. Even when my sister was present, my contributions began to stand out, if only faintly at first. The contrast between my previous humiliation and these new, modest successes was striking. I had spent years enduring favoritism and exclusion, feeling invisible and powerless. Now, each small victory reminded me that I could assert my worth in a controlled and deliberate way. I was no longer a passive observer. I was an active participant, capable of shaping how others perceived me. Of course, the victories were never unchallenged. My sister, always perceptive, began to notice the shift. Subtle changes in my confidence, my timing, and my presentation of accomplishments did not escape her attention. At first, her reactions were curious, almost amused, as if wondering what had sparked this sudden transformation. But soon, I sensed a flicker of tension, a recognition that the established hierarchy was being disrupted. The more I asserted myself, the more she tried to reassert dominance, creating a quiet tension that had not existed before. One evening, during a family gathering, I shared a story about a recent achievement at school. My parents responded politely. My sister interjected with her own tale of success. But I noticed a shift. She was more alert, more measured, and slightly defensive. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it signaled a change. She sensed that I was no longer the invisible sibling, the quiet one in the shadows. The first real acknowledgement of my presence, even if unspoken, had arrived. These small victories fueled my determination. Each moment of recognition, however minor, reinforced the lessons I had learned from my aunt and my years of careful observation. I began to understand that empowerment didn't require grand gestures. It could be cultivated through consistent, deliberate action. By asserting myself strategically, I could accumulate influence and recognition, gradually shifting the balance of attention in my favor. Alongside these personal victories, I also learned to savor the subtle emotional shifts they produced. Pride replaced the familiar ache of humiliation, satisfaction began to outweigh the sting of invisibility, and confidence started to temper the resentment that had long defined my relationship with my sister. These emotional transformations were as significant as any tangible acknowledgement. They signaled that the internal changes I had worked so hard to cultivate were taking root. The tension between my growing empowerment and my sister's awareness set the stage for inevitable conflict. Each small victory chipped away at the established dynamics, prompting subtle resistance from her. I could sense the flickers of jealousy, the carefully measured responses, the attempts to reclaim attention. This escalation was a natural consequence of disrupting a long-standing hierarchy, and it created a charged atmosphere that promised larger confrontations ahead. I began to approach these moments with strategy and patience. I celebrated victories, privately while observing reactions, cataloging responses, and refining my approach. Each small success became a building block, preparing me for more significant challenges. I understood that the real power lay not in immediate acknowledgement, but in the accumulation of influence, the slow but deliberate reshaping of perceptions, and the careful timing of my next moves. By the end of this period, I realized that the first steps toward reclaiming my voice and power were no longer hypothetical. The small victories had proven that recognition was achievable, that my presence could be acknowledged, and that the balance could be shifted. The empowerment I had cultivated quietly was beginning to manifest externally, and the tension it created hinted at a dramatic escalation to come. These modest triumphs, while seemingly insignificant to outsiders, were monumental for me. They marked the transition from enduring favoritism and invisibility to actively asserting my worth. Each victory was a reaffirmation of my capabilities, a testament to my patience, strategy, and resilience. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the long-standing dynamics in my family, a confrontation fueled by confidence, preparation, and the quiet accumulation of power. As I reflected on these early victories, I felt a mixture of pride and anticipation. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time, I sensed the possibility of lasting change. My sister had begun to notice. The family dynamics were subtly shifting, and I was ready to push further. The small victories had not only altered perceptions, they had transformed me, preparing me for the confrontations, strategies, and decisive moments that would define the next phase of my journey. And so, as the tension began to build, I understood that the moment of reckoning was approaching. The seeds of empowerment had taken root, and the once clear hierarchy of favoritism and invisibility was ready to be challenged. Small victories had paved the way for something larger, something that would test both my resolve and the fragile balance of recognition that had long dictated my life. For years, my sister had moved through our household like a force of nature, unquestioned, celebrated, untouchable. Her achievements, her charm, and her ability to command attention had long set the rhythm of family life. I had always been the shadow in which she thrived, quietly observing, cataloging, and enduring. But by the time I began accumulating small victories, that dynamic was quietly, almost imperceptibly shifting. And she noticed. It started with subtle glances across the dinner table. Normally, she had eyes only for my parents, confident in the knowledge that their attention was hers. But I began to see hesitation in her gaze, a flicker of awareness that I was no longer entirely invisible. During casual conversations, she began adjusting her tone when I spoke, listening more attentively, subtly probing, perhaps sensing that I was testing boundaries she had never imagined challenged. The ease she had always enjoyed was slightly unsettled. Her awareness grew as my confidence became more visible. I no longer waited for recognition. I claimed it strategically, asserting my presence through achievements, both small and deliberate. A well-timed anecdote about school success, a quietly impressive accomplishment at a family gathering, these moments were no longer overlooked. My sister, who had always been the benchmark of excellence in the family, now found herself measuring me against her own standards. The unspoken hierarchy of attention, which had long favored her, began to wobble. One evening during a family game night, the shift became undeniable. I won a challenge of strategy, an unexpected triumph that required skill, wit, and patience. My parents clapped politely, a little surprised, and my sister froze mid-laugh, her eyes narrowing slightly as she registered the change. There was no overt confrontation, no verbal acknowledgement, but the tension was palpable. It was the first time I could sense the quiet stirrings of unease in her, the first ripple of challenge to her established confidence. I noticed other signs too. She became slightly more competitive, sharper in her tone, and less inclined to give me space. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly for her now carried subtle probes and tests. Every compliment I received from teachers or friends was mirrored by a calculated display of her own achievements, a reinforcement of her status. The emotional contrast between her confidence and my rising self-worth created a charged atmosphere in the household, one that neither of us could ignore. This growing awareness was disorienting for her because it disrupted the predictable patterns. she had long relied on. She was accustomed to my quiet presence, my passive endurance, and my invisibility. Now she was confronted with a sibling who was not only visible, but increasingly competent, assertive, and strategic. The power dynamic was shifting, and she felt the first pricklings of uncertainty and rivalry. Our interactions began to carry a new weight. Casual remarks were laced with competitiveness, playful teasing had a sharper edge, and subtle jabs were now paired with calculating smiles. She no longer dismissed me casually. Instead, she evaluated, measured, and responded with careful attention. I, in turn, learned to navigate this tension with precision, keeping my composure while asserting my presence in ways that were impossible to ignore. I remember a specific incident that crystallized this shift. During a family celebration, I shared news of a scholarship I had earned. Normally, my sister would have overshadowed the moment with her own achievements, yet this time, she paused. Her response was polite, but measured, and I could see the flicker of realization in her eyes. I had stepped out of the shadow she had long assumed I would occupy. There was no overt confrontation, but the unspoken rivalry had begun, a subtle acknowledgement that our previously fixed roles were evolving. The emotional tension was electrifying. On one hand, I felt pride, validation, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing my strategy bear fruit. On the other, there was the underlying awareness that my sister's confidence and natural dominance were being challenged, and that this would not be without consequences. The subtle shift in her behavior signaled the beginning of a more complex dynamic, one that would test both our wits, patience, and resilience. As she became more aware of my growing independence, the stakes began to rise. Every achievement, every display of competence, was now not just personal growth. It was a challenge to her long-established dominance. The rivalry that had simmered beneath the surface for years was now surfacing, marked by subtle tension, competitive energy, and careful observation on both sides. Our interactions were no longer casual. They carried the weight of unspoken battles, strategy, and anticipation. This period also intensified my self-awareness. I had spent years enduring favoritism and invisibility, but now, I was learning to navigate attention and recognition deliberately. I had to anticipate her reactions, measure my words and actions, and maintain composure while asserting my worth. The contrast between her ingrained confidence and my newly cultivated self-assurance created a dynamic tension that was both exhilarating and daunting. By the end of this phase, it was clear. The balance had begun to shift. My sister had noticed, and her subtle reactions confirmed that the family dynamic was no longer predictable. The quiet rivalry that had been simmering beneath years of favoritism and invisibility was now coming to the surface. Each interaction carried stakes, each success prompted calculation, and the tension between us created an electric atmosphere in the household. The awareness that my sister had begun to perceive my growing independence marked the turning point toward open competition. The groundwork for conflict, strategic confrontation, and eventual rebalancing of attention had been laid. The sibling rivalry, once hidden in the shadows, was emerging into the light, setting the stage for the more intense challenges that would soon define our relationship. And as I navigated this new phase, I understood that the path forward required patience, precision, and strategy. The subtle tension, the awareness in her eyes, the calculated interactions, they were both a warning and an opportunity. I had grown stronger, more confident, and increasingly empowered. Now the next steps would test both our resolve, setting the stage for betrayal, payback, and the ultimate recalibration of recognition in a household that had long been unbalanced. The household had grown tense, though no one would have admitted it aloud. What had once been subtle favoritism had begun to clash with my growing assertiveness, creating an invisible pressure that seemed to thrum through every room. Each interaction, each family gathering, carried a weight that had not existed before. I could feel the quiet tension building, coiling like a spring ready to release, and I knew something had to give. It began with small arguments that quickly escalated. A discussion about weekend plans turned into a battleground of veiled accusations. My sister, ever perceptive, challenged every suggestion I made, subtly undermining my opinions with sly remarks and dismissive gestures. My parents, as usual, barely noticed, or perhaps deliberately ignored, the friction, brushing it off with polite platitudes while continuing to favor her accomplishments. I had learned to anticipate their responses, but the repeated dismissal grated harder now, fueled by my growing awareness of the imbalance. The contrast was stark. My sister, confident and self-assured, moved through these conflicts with a practiced ease, while I carefully measured my responses, trying to assert myself, without provoking outright hostility. There was fear lurking beneath my determination, the fear of repercussions, the fear of making a misstep that would reinforce my invisibility, but it was accompanied by a newfound strength. I was no longer the silent observer. I had begun to assert myself, however cautiously. One particularly heated evening crystallized the tensions that had been simmering for months. We were discussing an upcoming family event, and my suggestion for a volunteer role was immediately dismissed. My sister seized the opportunity to redirect the conversation toward her own plans, highlighting her schedule, achievements, and recognition from outside the family. My parents, predictably, agreed with her points, nodding and praising her organization and foresight while brushing aside my input. I felt a surge of frustration rise within me, sharp and immediate. The humiliation of being overlooked, of having my voice diminished yet again, flared like a torch. My chest tightened, my hands clenched, but I forced myself to remain calm. The years of observation, the strategies my aunt had taught me, all came rushing back. I had a choice: react impulsively and risk further dismissal, or channel this tension into a calculated move. Instead of arguing, I spoke with deliberate clarity. I understand that my suggestion might not seem as important, but it actually has significant benefits for everyone involved, I said, my voice steady, calm, yet firm. My parents glanced at me briefly, their expressions polite but distant, while my sister's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise, recognition, and perhaps irritation flickering across her face. It was a small victory, subtle but meaningful. My words had broken through the habitual pattern, even if only slightly, and I felt the first taste of influence over the conversation. The argument escalated subtly over the next few days. I noticed passive-aggressive comments, veiled criticisms, and the faintest attempts to undermine my efforts. My sister seemed to sense the shift, becoming more vigilant, calculating, and competitive. Meanwhile, my parents remained mostly oblivious, continuing to favor her successes while unintentionally highlighting my growing discomfort. The contrast between injustice and emerging self-assertion created an electric atmosphere. Every word, every glance, carried significance. During one family gathering, a long-standing grievance surfaced. My sister casually referenced an old incident from my childhood, one in which I had been unfairly blamed for a minor mistake. The comment, delivered with a practiced smile, was meant to undermine me, to remind everyone of my supposed shortcomings. I felt a familiar sting, but instead of retreating, I countered with calm recollection of the facts, highlighting the unfairness without attacking. The room fell momentarily silent, and for the first time I sensed genuine acknowledgement from my parents, even if tinged with discomfort. The realization hit me. Confrontation alone wasn't enough, but strategic assertion was beginning to shift. The dynamic. I could no longer rely on silence or patience alone. I needed a decisive move that would clearly demonstrate my worth and force the family to reckon with the imbalance. The simmering tension, the emotional undercurrents, and the subtle rivalries all pointed toward the necessity of action. This period of boiling tensions also revealed the psychological toll the household dynamics had taken on me. The years of invisibility, favoritism, and subtle humiliation had built a reservoir of emotional intensity that now demanded release. Yet I had learned to channel it constructively, using anger and frustration as motivation rather than allowing them to dictate my behavior. The contrast between fear of consequences and the emerging empowerment was sharp and vivid, creating a potent mix of suspense and determination. I began planning quietly, carefully, mapping the timing and execution of my next move. Every conversation, every family interaction became a rehearsal for the decisive moment I was building toward. I cataloged reactions, predicted responses, and considered contingencies. The tension in the household became a canvas on which I could design the reclamation of my voice, recognition, and power. By the end of this phase, I was acutely aware of the stakes. The family dynamics, long dominated by favoritism and invisibility, were fraying under the pressure of my growing assertiveness. The simmering arguments, veiled resentments, and subtle confrontations had revealed that change was possible, but only if I acted with precision, strategy, and courage. The emotional landscape was charged with suspense, fear, and anticipation, the perfect environment for a decisive move that would alter the balance once and for all. As I reflected on the rising tension, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. The injustice of the past remained, but it was now coupled with opportunity. The family's continued favoritism, the sisters' vigilance, and the subtle hostilities were challenges I could navigate with skill. The plan for a decisive act was forming in my mind, a move that would force recognition, shift perceptions, and lay the groundwork for the eventual recalibration of our family hierarchy. The boiling over of family tensions was no accident. It was the natural consequence of years of imbalance, meeting years of careful observation and growing self-assertion. The stage was set for action, the players were in place, and the emotional stakes could not have been higher. Injustice had met resistance, and the result was a charged environment where strategy, courage, and timing would determine the outcome. And so, in the shadow of conflict, with fear and anticipation entwined, I prepared for the decisive move that would begin, to reclaim not just recognition, but respect, power, and visibility within the family. The simmering tension had become the catalyst for transformation, and the next chapter would mark the first bold steps toward payback and recalibration. The boiling tension in the household had reached a point where patience alone was no longer sufficient. I could feel the weight of years of favoritism, dismissal, and invisibility pressing down, but I also felt a spark, an unrelenting determination to reclaim what had always been denied. I knew that change wouldn't come by chance, or confrontation alone. It required strategy, precision, and timing. And so, I began to plan. I started by reviewing every instance of favoritism I had endured, every moment my accomplishments had been minimized, and every subtle humiliation that had chipped away at my self-worth. These memories were painful, yes, but they were also data, evidence of patterns that could be anticipated and navigated. Where I had once felt powerless, I now felt empowered by knowledge. I understood the triggers, the routines, and the predictable biases that had long defined the family dynamic. The plan had to be precise. It couldn't be impulsive, because impulsive actions had always been dismissed or ignored. I needed to create a situation where my contributions, competence, and value were undeniable, where my voice could no longer be minimized. Every detail mattered, from timing, phrasing, and presentation, to the subtle ways in which I could assert visibility without provoking defensiveness. My aunt's guidance echoed in my mind. Empowerment was a skill, and like any skill, it required deliberate practice. I mapped out potential scenarios, imagining how my sister might react, how my parents would respond, and where their biases might either hinder or inadvertently aid me. Each outcome was considered carefully. I analyzed my own behavior as well, how I would maintain composure, assert clarity, and exude confidence. I recognized that the emotional stakes were high. Failure could result in humiliation, setback, or reinforcement of the invisibility I had worked so hard to escape. But the potential reward, recognition, respect, and the rebalancing of family dynamics was worth the risk. The first step of my plan involved highlighting my achievements in a way that couldn't be dismissed. I collected evidence of my recent successes, school awards, volunteer accomplishments, leadership roles, and other tangible demonstrations of skill and responsibility. I considered how each piece of evidence could be presented strategically, during moments when attention was focused, when my parents were receptive, and when my sister was less able to overshadow the moment. Each small victory I had accumulated was now a tool to be leveraged. Equally important was psychological preparation. I rehearsed my words, refining how I would express my contributions without appearing boastful, confrontational, or aggressive. Confidence, I realized, was as much about delivery as content. I practiced calm, steady speech, deliberate pacing, and the subtle cues that signal authority without demanding attention overtly. I visualized each encounter, anticipating potential pushback and mentally scripting responses that would maintain composure while asserting presence. I also accounted for my sister's likely reactions. She had always been perceptive and strategic, and I knew she would notice any attempt to claim attention or challenge her dominance. My plan included ways to assert my achievements without triggering overt hostility, ways to maintain credibility, while subtly reshaping the family hierarchy. It was a delicate balance. Too much force could provoke defensive backlash. Too little could result in continued invisibility. Preparation extended beyond strategy and rehearsal. I strengthened my personal resilience, reminding myself of the years of endurance, observation, and skill building that had brought me to this point. The humiliation, favoritism, and invisibility I had suffered were now converted into fuel, motivation, to execute a plan that was no longer hypothetical, but actionable. I felt a rare clarity. Where once I had been reactive, I was now proactive, anticipating, and orchestrating. The stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't merely about recognition. It was about asserting dignity, recalibrating respect, and confronting years of systemic bias within the family. I understood that the success of my plan would reshape interactions permanently, altering the patterns that had long defined our relationships. The tension of possibility and risk created a charged emotional state. Fear mingled with exhilaration, caution intertwined with determination. I documented my plan meticulously, breaking it down into phases. First, visibility, demonstrating competence through undeniable actions. Second, strategic acknowledgement, timing moments of recognition to maximize impact. Third, subtle reinforcement, ensuring that each assertion was reinforced by consistent behavior, making my value undeniable. Over time, each phase built upon the last, creating a layered approach designed to withstand resistance and create lasting change. At the same time, I rehearsed internally for resistance. I anticipated dismissals, deflections, and attempts to reassert favoritism. For every scenario, I devised responses that maintained composure, reinforced credibility, and emphasized my value without appearing desperate or aggressive. I had learned that empowerment was most effective when it was calm, deliberate, and unmistakable. By the time the plan was fully formed, I felt a shift within myself. The helplessness of the past had been replaced by agency. The invisibility that had defined my early years was no longer absolute. I had cultivated strategy, patience, and insight. I was ready to step forward, not recklessly, but with precision, leveraging every tool at my disposal to reclaim recognition and respect. The planning process also reinforced my confidence. Every detail considered, every potential reaction anticipated, and every personal strength acknowledged contributed to a growing sense of control. I understood that while outcomes could never be guaranteed, the execution of a well-prepared plan drastically increased the likelihood of success. Where once I had endured passively, I now faced the future armed with strategy, knowledge, and purpose. And so, as the household continued its subtle but tense rhythms, I prepared to enact the first phase of my plan. The stage was set for confrontation, visibility, and strategic assertion. My sister's growing awareness, the simmering family tensions, and the accumulation of my own skills and victories created the perfect environment for decisive action. The contrast between my former helplessness and this emerging empowerment could not have been clearer. I had transformed from a passive, invisible observer into an active, strategic participant in my own life. And as I moved closer to execution, the anticipation was electrifying. Fear of failure mingled with the thrill of finally claiming my voice and position within the family. Every detail, every rehearsal, and every calculated choice pointed to the same inevitable truth. The time for action had arrived. The plan for justice, painstakingly developed over months of observation, mentorship, and strategy, was ready to be executed. Recognition, respect, and the recalibration of power within the household were no longer distant dreams. They were within reach, awaiting the precise moment to manifest. The day had arrived. Months of planning, observation, and strategic preparation had all led to this moment. I could feel the tension in my chest, the pulse of anticipation and anxiety coursing through my veins. For years, I had endured invisibility, favoritism, and subtle humiliation, keeping my thoughts and achievements hidden while my sister moved through the family as the unquestioned center of attention. Now I was ready to speak, ready to assert myself, ready to confront the patterns that had defined our household for far too long. It began quietly, almost innocuously, during a family dinner. My sister was recounting yet another of her accomplishments, her voice bright, confident, and full of the attention she had come to expect. My parents were nodding, smiling, and offering praise, completely absorbed in her narrative. I felt the familiar mix of frustration and resentment rise, but I reminded myself to stay calm, measured, and deliberate. This confrontation would not be an outburst. It would be a statement, a reclamation of voice and presence. Taking a deep breath, I interrupted, my voice steady but firm. "I need to say something," I began, all eyes turning toward me. The room fell silent, an almost tangible stillness descending. My parents looked startled. My sister's expression shifted from amusement to curiosity, then to a flicker of apprehension. I've spent years watching as my efforts, my achievements, and my contributions are overlooked. I've watched favoritism guide attention and praise, while I was dismissed, ignored, or even blamed unfairly. And I won't stay silent anymore. Words hung in the air, electric with tension. My sister's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and disbelief. My parents exchanged glances, their expressions caught between surprise and discomfort. I could feel the shift in energy, a recognition that this was unlike anything they had experienced before from me. The invisible, quiet sibling had finally stepped forward, refusing to be ignored. I continued, outlining specific incidents, moments of dismissal, and subtle humiliations I had endured. I spoke with clarity, composure, and precision, framing my words not as accusations, but as undeniable truths. I highlighted the disparities in attention, the repeated favoritism toward my sister, and the countless times my contributions had been minimized or ignored. Every detail, every carefully chosen example, was designed to make the invisible visible, to give voice to years of silenced frustration. The emotional intensity surged within me. Anger, yes, but tempered by courage and focus. Fear lingered at the edges, a reminder of the risks of speaking out, but it was overshadowed by the power of assertion. For the first time, humiliation transformed into authority. My words carried weight, my presence demanded acknowledgement, and the room, previously accustomed to my silence, now held its collective breath. My sister tried to interject, her voice initially calm but tense. "I think you're exaggerating," she said, a carefully measured attempt to deflect attention back to herself. But I held my ground, maintaining eye contact, refusing to allow her to redirect the conversation. "I'm not exaggerating," I replied firmly. "These patterns have been clear for years, and I deserve recognition too. Not in comparison, not as a contest, but because my efforts matter." My parents reacted in a mix of disbelief and discomfort. My mother opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated, caught between instinctive defense of my sister and the undeniable clarity of my statements. My father shifted in his seat, brow furrowed as if struggling to reconcile years of assumptions with the truth I had presented. The balance of authority in the room had subtly shifted. I was no longer invisible. My voice, long suppressed, had asserted itself in ways that could not be ignored. The immediate fallout was electric. My sister's usual confidence faltered, replaced by a flicker of defensiveness and unease. She struggled to maintain her composure, realizing for the first time that her dominance in the family dynamic was not unchallenged. I could see the calculations in her eyes, how to respond, how to reclaim control, how to assert herself in the face of this new assertiveness from me. The confrontation continued, with back-and-forth exchanges that were tense, sharp, but controlled. I maintained calm authority, grounding my arguments in truth, personal experience, and observable patterns. Each statement chipped away at the habitual dismissal I had endured. Each assertion reinforced my presence and demanded acknowledgement. The emotional peak was a heady mixture: fear of backlash, courage to speak, and satisfaction in finally claiming the voice that had been denied for so long. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The usual rhythm of family interactions, dominated by my sister's effortless attention, had been disrupted. My words had created ripples of shock, disbelief, and reflection. The room was charged, a mix of tension and newfound awareness. My parents, while not fully processing the implications, could not ignore the clarity and composure with which I had presented my case. For me, the confrontation was transformative. I had faced years of suppression, favoritism, and invisibility, and emerged with voice, authority, and presence. The contrast between past humiliation and this newfound empowerment was stark, almost intoxicating. I could feel a shift not only in how my family perceived me, but also in how I perceived myself. The invisible had become visible. The dismissed had become assertive. The powerless had begun to wield influence. But even as the confrontation ended, I sensed the immediate tension that would follow. My sister, now aware that her dominance was no longer unchallenged, would respond, strategically, subtly, and perhaps with intensity. The emotional battlefield had shifted, and the fallout of my words would ripple through family interactions in unpredictable ways. I understood that this was just the beginning, the first act in a new dynamic of recognition, rivalry, and recalibrated power. And as I reflected on the evening, I felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and quiet triumph. Fear had been met with courage, humiliation with voice, and years of invisibility with assertion. The confrontation had not resolved every imbalance, but it had established a new reality. I was present. My contributions mattered, and I would no longer allow favoritism and dismissal to define my place in the family. The immediate aftermath, the shock, disbelief, and subtle tension, was a precursor to the ongoing struggle, the calculated moves, and the eventual payback that would reshape our household forever. The moment I had spoken up, asserting my voice, and demanding acknowledgement, I knew the battle was far from over. My confrontation had shifted the balance in subtle but undeniable ways, and my sister, ever perceptive and cunning, immediately recognized the threat. Within days, I began to see the first signs of retaliation, quiet, calculated, and designed to undermine the progress I had fought so hard to achieve. It started with subtle manipulations. At family gatherings, she would casually interject, reframing my successes as lucky breaks or fleeting accomplishments. Her tone was light, almost playful, but I could feel the underlying intent to diminish my achievements in front of our parents and reassert the dominance she had always enjoyed. Each comment, each sly smile, was a reminder that she was unwilling to accept the new equilibrium I had begun to establish. My parents, still largely unaware of the depth of favoritism, were initially receptive to her framing. They nodded politely at her explanations, sometimes even laughing at what she presented as innocent observations. The sting of being subtly undermined was familiar, but this time it was different. I no longer internalized the humiliation passively. I observed, cataloged, and prepared, aware that her tactics were predictable patterns born of insecurity and a desire to maintain control. One evening, she escalated her approach. During a discussion about a family project, she openly challenged my ideas, presenting her own as superior and dismissing my suggestions with a mix of charm and assertiveness. I felt the familiar pang of frustration and the urge to react impulsively, but I remembered the strategy I had cultivated. Instead of engaging in a direct argument, I listened carefully, acknowledged her points when valid, and then calmly highlighted the merits of my own approach. My tone was steady, composed, and assertive, signaling that I would not be intimidated or sidelined. The psychological tension in the household grew palpable. My sister's efforts to manipulate perception and regain control collided with my measured assertion and growing confidence. She tried to frame my successes as inconsequential, but I had prepared for these moments, and each time I responded with calm authority, subtly dismantling her attempts without overt conflict. The contrast between her manipulative tactics and my emerging strength created an electric, suspenseful atmosphere. An invisible duel played out in every word, glance, and gesture. She also began to employ more subtle strategies, aiming to sway our parents against me. Whispered comments, exaggerated interpretations of my mistakes, and selective storytelling became tools in her arsenal. The goal was clear: to make me appear reckless, ungrateful, or less competent, reinforcing her long-standing position as the favored child. Yet, unlike in the past, I no longer relied on my parents' awareness or validation. I had learned to ground my confidence internally, using external recognition as reinforcement rather than a requirement for self-worth. At first, I felt a flicker of frustration and anxiety. It was disorienting to see someone so skilled at psychological maneuvering attempt to destabilize me. But I quickly recognized that my prior experiences had prepared me for this exact scenario. I had developed patience, observation, and resilience, and I now applied those skills deliberately. Each manipulative tactic she deployed became a predictable variable in a larger equation I was learning to control. I also began to subtly assert influence in ways she could not easily counter. During discussions, I highlighted collaborative successes and framed my contributions in contexts that were difficult to dismiss. I shared achievements in a calm, factual manner, letting evidence speak louder than words or charm. The more I presented undeniable results, the less effective her manipulations became. Her attempts to undermine me gradually revealed cracks in her carefully maintained facade, as she struggled to respond without appearing defensive or petty. One particularly tense moment occurred during a family meeting about holiday plans. She attempted to delegitimize my input, claiming that I had not considered important details, framing me as careless and inattentive. I maintained composure, calmly outlining my considerations with clarity and thoroughness. The contrast was stark. Her attempt at control appeared reactive and defensive, while my measured authority commanded attention and respect. My parents, for the first time, seemed to genuinely consider my perspective, signaling a shift in recognition that had once seemed impossible. Throughout this period, the psychological stakes were high. Every interaction with my sister carried subtle threats and potential setbacks. Yet each moment also reinforced my resilience and strategy. I had learned to differentiate between manipulation designed to provoke emotion and opportunities to assert influence strategically. Where once I had been reactive, now I was proactive, using her attempts at control as a canvas to demonstrate composure, capability, and credibility. Her retaliation also had the unintended effect of solidifying my self-awareness and internal strength. Each attempt to destabilize me forced me to reflect, strategize, and respond with calculated precision. I began to anticipate patterns, recognize triggers, and leverage moments to strengthen my presence rather than allowing them to diminish it. The contrast between her defensive maneuvers and my deliberate assertiveness highlighted the shift in our dynamic. She relied on habitual dominance, while I relied on conscious empowerment. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the household equilibrium had fundamentally changed. My sister's control tactics, once effective, were increasingly transparent and predictable. I had begun to rise above manipulation, asserting myself in ways that were undeniable and increasingly respected. The emotional tension remained high, suspense and psychological complexity defining every interaction, but the momentum had shifted in my favor. The experience reinforced a crucial truth. True empowerment was not about reacting to every provocation, but about measured responses, strategic positioning, and internal confidence. As my sister's attempts at undermining me became less effective, I realized that the power dynamics were finally tilting, slowly, deliberately, and irrevocably. And so, as I navigated this period of psychological tension, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and caution. I had survived her manipulations, maintained my composure, and asserted authority. The household, once ruled by her effortless dominance, now bore the unmistakable marks of change. The next steps would require continued strategy, patience, and precision, but I had proven to myself that I could rise above manipulation, setting the stage for even greater reclamation of respect, recognition, and power. For months, the tension in our household had been like a storm, invisible but relentless, shaking the foundations of every interaction. My sister's subtle retaliations, my parents' blind favoritism, and the constant psychological maneuvering had tested my patience, resilience, and self-confidence. I had fought for recognition, asserted my voice, and defended my accomplishments. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the fight itself, this ongoing struggle for validation, was not the end. The turning point came in the quiet moments of reflection, when I finally understood that empowerment was not about revenge, it was about self-worth. I remember sitting alone in my room one evening, the hum of the household muted beneath the dim light. My mind wandered over every argument, every dismissal, every instance of favoritism I had endured. I felt the familiar sting of resentment rise, the urge to retaliate or to orchestrate some perfect payback. But in that stillness, I paused and asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. Am I fighting to prove something to them? Or am I fighting to reclaim myself? It was a revelation. The months of careful planning, observation, and strategic assertion had accomplished something far more significant than simply exposing my sister's manipulations or confronting parental bias. They had built my confidence, sharpened my insight, and strengthened my sense of agency. I realized that empowerment came not from forcing recognition, but from cultivating self-respect, acknowledging my own worth regardless of external approval. The contrast between past resentment and emerging self-respect was profound. Where I had once measured my value through the lens of family approval, I now began to see myself objectively, celebrating my efforts, accomplishments, and resilience independently. The humiliation that had once defined my self-perception was replaced by pride and awareness. I could face my sister's manipulations without fear, not because I had won a confrontation, but because I had reclaimed my own narrative. This shift altered the way I interacted with the household. I no longer sought validation through confrontation or strategic exposure. Instead, I acted with quiet confidence, letting actions speak louder than words. When my sister attempted to undermine me, her efforts now seemed small against the solid foundation of my self-worth. I responded with calm authority, not to punish, but because I understood my own value and was unwilling to allow anyone to diminish it. I also noticed the subtle changes in my parents' behavior. My mother's casual dismissal of my achievements was no longer a wound, it was an observation. My father's habit of comparing me unfavorably to my sister became irrelevant because I was no longer measuring myself by her standards. The emotional liberation was intoxicating. For the first time, I felt a sense of freedom within my own family, not the freedom to dominate, but the freedom to exist fully and confidently as myself. The turning point also reshaped my relationship with my sister. I still recognized her cunning, charm, and manipulative tendencies, but I no longer viewed them as insurmountable threats. I saw them as reflections of her own insecurities and fears, tools she had relied upon to maintain control. In a household structured around favoritism, this perspective allowed me to approach interactions with empathy, clarity, and detachment. I could assert myself without being provoked emotionally, maintaining calm authority while she tested boundaries. One particular moment crystallized this new approach. During a casual family discussion, my sister began to subtly discredit an achievement of mine, framing it as insignificant. In the past, I would have reacted defensively or sought to counter her narrative. This time, I simply acknowledged her comment, smiled, and continued calmly sharing my perspective. My parents listened, nodded, and offered recognition without drama. The contrast was remarkable. Her usual attempts at control had no grip over my confidence, and my self-respect had transformed potential conflict into quiet authority. This moment, also reinforced the broader lesson I had internalized. Empowerment is not about dismantling others, it is about building oneself. Years of resentment, humiliation, and invisibility had been valuable teachers, but they had served their purpose only when I chose to transform them into self-awareness, courage, and agency. My focus shifted from revenge to personal growth, from proving my worth to living it authentically. With this clarity, I began taking deliberate steps toward independence. I sought achievements, opportunities, and responsibilities that were meaningful to me, not as instruments to assert superiority over my sister, but as authentic expressions of my abilities and passions. I nurtured friendships, mentors, and experiences outside the family, creating a network of support and recognition that reinforced the internal foundation I had built. The household dynamics remained challenging, but I was no longer dependent on them for validation. The emotional payoff was profound. The storm of tension, manipulation, and favoritism that had dominated my early years in the family began to feel like a distant memory, reframed through the lens of self-worth and empowerment. I understood that true change did not require the collapse of my sister or the awakening of my parents. It required the cultivation of my own agency, the assertion of my own presence, and the consistent practice of self-respect. As I embraced this new perspective, the atmosphere in the household subtly shifted. Interactions with my sister were no longer battles but negotiations of coexistence. Moments of potential manipulation lost their power over me, and my parents began to unconsciously recognize my growing autonomy and confidence. The contrast between past helplessness and present self-assurance was undeniable. I had moved from resentment to self-respect, from invisibility to quiet, undeniable presence. This turning point marked a pivotal moment in my journey. It was not the end of conflict, but it was the foundation for lasting change. I realized that empowerment is an internal process, cultivated through reflection, strategy, and courage. External recognition may fluctuate, favoritism may persist, and rivalries may continue, but the core of my strength, my self-worth, was untouchable, resilient, and unshakable. With this realization, I began preparing for the next phase of my life, taking control of my destiny, asserting independence, and building a life defined by authenticity rather than validation. The tension, the manipulation, and the household power struggles had served their purpose. They had taught me resilience, strategic thinking, and the irreplaceable value of self-respect. And as I looked forward, I understood that the final resolution was not about vanquishing my sister or forcing recognition from my parents. It was about fully embracing my own worth, walking with confidence, and allowing my presence and achievements to speak for themselves. The turning point was complete. Resentment had transformed into empowerment, humiliation into self-respect, and struggle into clarity. The foundation for independence and lasting fulfillment had been laid, and nothing could undo the growth that had emerged from years of challenge. The months following my turning point were transformative, though subtly. At first, I had embraced self-worth and clarity, and now the task was to translate that internal empowerment into tangible recognition, both within the family and beyond. I began taking decisive actions that reflected my capabilities and my determination to no longer be invisible. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, and designed to reclaim not just a voice, but power. Quiet, undeniable, and lasting. It began with accomplishments outside the immediate family sphere, school, work, and community projects where effort was rewarded on merit rather than favoritism. I threw myself into challenges with focus, knowing that tangible success would speak where arguments and complaints could not. Each recognition, each achievement, reinforced my confidence and served as proof of my capabilities, slowly recalibrating perceptions both internally and externally. At first, my sister noticed the shift with subtle unease. Her usual ease and confidence began to waver whenever I entered a room or shared a success. I could see it in her eyes. Calculated evaluations, tentative adjustments to tone, and attempts to reassert the dominance she had always assumed. But this time, I did not flinch. I had cultivated the patience, strategic thinking, and composure to withstand these attempts at undermining. Her maneuvers no longer threatened my sense of self. Within the family, the changes became increasingly visible. During a family gathering, I presented a significant achievement, a project I had completed that required months of dedication and skill. My parents, who had often minimized my efforts, now listened attentively. Their responses, while measured, carried genuine acknowledgement. My sister's attempt to redirect attention back to herself faltered. For the first time, I felt the stark contrast between prior invisibility and the respect I was commanding through consistent, undeniable effort. The emotional impact was profound. Relief and triumph mingled as I realized that recognition did not need to be forced through confrontation. It could be earned and observed. Each success, each moment of acknowledgement, reinforced the internal foundation I had built during months of reflection, planning, and assertion. Where humiliation had once dominated, now pride and quiet authority emerged. I also noticed subtle shifts in family dynamics beyond direct acknowledgement. My sister's usual ease in dominating conversations diminished. She spoke less confidently and occasionally sought my opinion in matters she had previously dismissed outright. It was not complete submission, far from it, but the balance of influence had shifted. I was no longer a background figure. I had carved a space where my contributions were considered, valued, and sometimes even deferred to. This reclamation of power extended beyond mere recognition. It was deeply psychological, a reinforcement of agency and identity. The patterns that had once constrained me, the favoritism, the dismissals, and the subtle psychological manipulations, had lost their grip. I now operated from a position of quiet authority, guided by self-respect and strategic awareness. My sister's attempts at control no longer dictated my emotions or decisions. They were variables to be observed and navigated rather than threats to my self-worth. One particularly striking moment occurred during a family planning discussion. My sister attempted to overshadow me, as she had for years, but I remained composed and asserted my perspective clearly, supporting it with logic and evidence. My parents, now witnessing the consistency and validity of my input, deferred to my suggestions. The triumph was quiet, yet profound. Authority was no longer inherited by favoritism, but earned and recognized through competence and composure. As I accumulated recognition, I also observed the broader impact on my self-image. Each achievement and acknowledgement reinforced a sense of agency I had long lacked. The empowerment that had begun internally now manifested externally in ways that were undeniable. I felt an unshakable balance between humility and pride. Humility in knowing that success is earned through effort and perseverance. Pride in the knowledge that my capabilities could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The contrast with my past invisibility was striking. I had endured years of silence, marginalization, and subtle humiliation, and now I moved confidently through the same spaces with acknowledgement and respect. My presence carried weight, and my voice commanded attention without aggression. It was a powerful validation of the strategies, self-reflection, and resilience I had cultivated. Even my sister, while still capable and accomplished in her own right, could no longer dominate the family dynamic unchecked. Recognition, once her exclusive domain, had expanded to include me, recalibrating the hierarchy and shifting the emotional landscape. The psychological relief was enormous. The tension that had defined interactions for years had eased, replaced by a new, more balanced understanding of presence and authority. By the end of this phase, it was clear. The reclamation of power was not just about recognition or visibility. It was about the profound internal transformation that allowed me to act with confidence, strategic clarity, and authenticity. Triumph was no longer external alone. It was internal, undeniable, and enduring. And as the family began to react, some with admiration, some with subtle resentment, I understood that the foundations of influence had shifted. The patterns of favoritism, subtle control, and marginalization had been challenged, not through overt conflict alone, but through the deliberate assertion of capability, composure, and presence. I had moved from invisibility to undeniable influence, from marginalized observer to a participant whose voice and actions demanded recognition. This reclamation of power marked a critical stage in the journey. Triumph tempered with patience, authority built through strategy and effort, and the subtle but irreversible rebalancing of family dynamics. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer defined by favoritism or invisibility, but by competence, resilience, and self-earned respect. The shift in the household did not happen quietly, even though my approach had always been measured and deliberate. My sister, once so accustomed to unquestioned admiration, was visibly unsettled. My parents, who had rarely paused to evaluate my worth independently of their biases, were beginning to process a reality that had been long overdue. For the first time, they were witnessing not just my achievements, but the confidence, calm, authority, and undeniable presence that I carried alongside them. It happened gradually, during the small but significant moments of family life. A casual discussion about weekend plans, an update on school or work accomplishments, even a conversation about trivial matters. All of these interactions now carried weight because I had cultivated a presence that could no longer be ignored. My sister's attempts to dominate the narrative or reclaim attention faltered as my calm assertiveness met her usual tactics with subtle authority. Each reaction she displayed, hesitation, frustration, or forced composure, was evidence of the transformation she could not unsee. My parents' disbelief was equally revealing. My father, who had often dismissed my efforts as inconsequential, now asked questions, sought clarification, and even expressed pride in ways that had once seemed unimaginable. My mother, the perennial mediator and quiet enforcer of favoritism, now paused, nodded thoughtfully, and acknowledged contributions that she would have previously overlooked. Their reactions were not immediate or perfect, but they were real, tangible signs that the household was beginning to recognize the change I had enacted. I could see it in their eyes: shock, uncertainty, and the dawning realization that the invisible child, the one who had quietly endured years of marginalization, had emerged fully into presence and authority. My sister's confidence, once untouchable, now wavered. She glanced at me with curiosity, calculation, and, perhaps for the first time, genuine respect, though mixed with the subtle sting of rivalry. The balance of the household had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if only subconsciously. Emotionally, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and quiet justice. This was not revenge, nor a public humiliation of my sister or parents. Rather, it was a demonstration of what had always been true. My efforts, abilities, and self-worth were undeniable. I had finally carved a space where recognition was based on merit, consistency, and presence, not favoritism or charm. The sense of satisfaction was deep, rooted in years of endurance, reflection, and calculated action. I also noticed the subtle reflections happening within my sister. Her habitual confidence had been replaced, temporarily at least, by uncertainty. She was forced to reevaluate her assumptions about control, dominance, and influence within our family. There were moments when she sought to reclaim the old hierarchy, attempting brief assertions of authority, but I met each one with calm composure, not confrontation. The psychological power shift was clear. She could no longer manipulate or overshadow with the ease she once relied upon. My parents, too, seemed to reflect on their long-standing biases. I could sense a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and tentative acknowledgement in their reactions. They were processing the years in which favoritism had defined interactions, recognizing that my growth, maturity, and accomplishments demanded recognition that had been long withheld. For the first time, I felt that their awareness of my value was not simply reactive. It was reflective, considered, and genuine. One evening, after a particularly charged family discussion about future plans, I noticed my sister quietly acknowledging my contributions without interjection or manipulation. My parents were engaged, listening thoughtfully to my perspectives, nodding at ideas and achievements. The transformation was subtle, but profound. The household energy had shifted from habitual imbalance to a space where my presence, skill, and voice were accepted and respected. This period of shock and reflection also allowed me to process my own emotions. I felt a deep sense of closure with the past, the humiliation, the invisibility, and the dismissals that had long defined my relationship with my sister and parents. While tension and rivalry remained, they were no longer defining forces in our interactions. I could move forward with confidence, knowing that my self-worth was acknowledged internally and externally. The contrast between their disbelief and my calm confidence was particularly striking. While they processed the reality of my transformation, I carried an almost serene awareness of my achievements, my strategy, and my growth. The quiet authority I had developed was now visible not just in my actions, but in the way I held myself, spoke, and interacted with the family. The contrast was palpable. Years of favoritism and control met with the composed strength of someone who had endured, reflected, and emerged stronger. Emotionally, the satisfaction was not rooted in punishment or revenge. Instead, it was in witnessing the subtle but undeniable acknowledgement of my value. The years of marginalization had forged resilience, patience, and insight, and now those qualities were visible to the entire household. The psychological equilibrium was still fragile, but the foundation for lasting respect and recognition had been established. The family's shock and reflection also paved the way for reconciliation, or at least coexistence with greater understanding. My sister and I could now navigate our interactions with more awareness. My parents could engage without unconscious bias, and the household, while not perfect, had shifted toward a more balanced and equitable dynamic. The emotional catharsis of this stage was profound, highlighting that empowerment rooted in self-worth carries far more weight than attempts at revenge or retaliation. By the end of this period, it was clear the narrative of invisibility and favoritism had been disrupted. My presence, authority, and accomplishments could no longer be overlooked. The family had witnessed the transformation, and in their shock, disbelief, and subtle reflection, they had begun to recognize the consequences of their past actions and assumptions. The emotional satisfaction of justice, quiet, composed, and internalized, was finally mine. As the household adjusted to this new reality, I felt a sense of clarity and closure. I had navigated the long path from invisibility to recognition, from resentment to self-respect, and from marginalization to authority. The story was nearing its final chapters, where the lessons, triumphs, and emotional catharsis would be fully realized. The stage was set for the concluding moments where independence, empowerment, and reflection would converge. Looking back on the years of struggle, invisibility, and favoritism, I'm struck by how much those experiences shaped me, not just in terms of resilience, but in the way I understand myself, relationships, and the dynamics of power. For so long, I measured my worth through the lens of my family's approval, navigating a world where recognition was unevenly distributed and my voice often ignored. The helplessness I once felt was real, visceral, and constant. Yet, through reflection, strategic action, and the slow accumulation of confidence, I realized that the most profound power is internal. The ability to define your value, set boundaries, and assert yourself without needing permission or validation from others. One of the most important lessons I learned is that invisibility does not equate to weakness. For years, I felt small because my contributions were overlooked, my successes minimized, and my presence taken for granted. But strength is not always loud. It is cultivated in patience, observation, and careful action. By remaining aware of patterns, anticipating manipulation, and nurturing my own abilities, I was able to transform what once felt like a disadvantage into a foundation for empowerment. The contrast between past helplessness and present self-assurance is stark. I no longer wait for acknowledgement to feel valued, because I have learned to recognize my worth independently. Another lesson is the value of calm and deliberate strategy in the face of injustice. My family dynamics, especially my sister's manipulations and my parents' favoritism, could have led me to react impulsively or aggressively. In the past, that would have resulted in humiliation, escalation, or defeat. But by approaching each interaction with careful observation, measured responses, and strategic patience, I was able to assert myself effectively while maintaining dignity and composure. Empowerment does not require confrontation at every turn. Sometimes it is quiet, deliberate, and invisible to those who seek to control you. I also learned the importance of separating self-worth from external validation. Early on, I sought recognition and approval desperately, measuring myself against my sister's achievements and the constant stream of praise she received. That cycle was exhausting and damaging. Over time, I realized that true empowerment comes from internal recognition of effort, capability, and integrity. When I stopped relying solely on external approval, I began to act authentically, pursue meaningful goals, and command respect, not by demanding it, but by earning it through consistent action and presence. Equally significant was the understanding of empathy and perspective. Witnessing my sister's reactions, her manipulations, and her occasional defensiveness revealed her insecurities and fears, which had fueled her need for favoritism. Recognizing that her actions were not purely malicious but rooted in her own challenges allowed me to approach interactions with a mixture of compassion and strategic clarity. True empowerment does not require hostility. It can coexist with understanding and measured patience. The journey also emphasized the power of resilience. Years of exclusion, subtle humiliation, and psychological games could have left me bitter or passive. Instead, I used each challenge as a lesson, a rehearsal for strength and awareness. Resilience is not about avoiding pain or confrontation. It is about enduring, reflecting, and transforming adversity into opportunity. Every setback, slight or moment of invisibility, became a stepping stone toward clarity, agency, and eventual recognition. Moreover, I discovered the significance of personal boundaries. In a household dominated by favoritism and manipulation, I often absorbed blame or suppressed my feelings to maintain peace. Learning to define and assert boundaries, politely but firmly, was crucial in reclaiming autonomy. Boundaries are not just about self-protection. They are about establishing presence and ensuring that your contributions and voice are respected. This lesson, though learned gradually, became foundational to my empowerment. Reflection also reinforced the idea that recognition and respect cannot be demanded. They must be earned and observed. The shift in family dynamics was not immediate, and it was not guaranteed. But through consistent effort, assertiveness, and strategic communication, I created a space where my worth could no longer be ignored. This process required patience, observation, and courage, the willingness to act even when the outcome was uncertain. Importantly, I came to understand that empowerment is a long-term journey, not a single moment of confrontation. Every assertion, every success, every calm demonstration of competence built upon the previous, creating momentum that could not be undone. The contrast between the years of quiet suffering and the current sense of agency is instructive. Growth is cumulative, and resilience compounds over time when paired with awareness and intentional action. Finally, the journey taught me that personal growth has universal relevance. Many viewers may recognize themselves in the pain of favoritism, the sting of exclusion, or the frustration of being overshadowed by someone else. The path from helplessness to empowerment is not unique to me. It is a universal story of learning. To assert self-worth, navigate unfair dynamics, and cultivate strength internally, rather than relying solely on external validation. By sharing these experiences, I hope to inspire others to reflect, act, and reclaim their own voice and presence. In summary, my journey illuminated the stark contrasts that define personal growth. Helplessness versus empowerment, invisibility versus recognition, resentment versus self-respect. It demonstrated that internal strength, strategic patience, resilience, and clarity are more powerful than confrontation alone. These lessons connect personal struggle to universal truths, offering a blueprint for anyone navigating toxic relationships, favoritism, or marginalization. As I reflect on these lessons, the next step becomes clear. The emotional catharsis, the final resolution, and the consolidation of all the growth, empowerment, and strategy into a lasting sense of autonomy and fulfillment. The story is poised for its ultimate payoff, where empowerment meets closure, and the long journey of struggle transforms fully into triumph. After years of tension, favoritism, and subtle humiliation, I finally reached a point where the storm had calmed. The household was no longer defined by invisible hierarchies or unchecked manipulation. My sister's dominance had softened, my parents' awareness had grown, and I had carved a space of undeniable presence, recognition, and respect. The journey from exclusion to belonging had been long and painstaking, but the emotional payoff was profound, a sense of justice, empowerment, and personal closure that no external validation could replicate. It began with a simple, quiet acknowledgement from my parents. One evening, during a discussion about family plans, my father paused, nodded at me thoughtfully, and said, "I hadn't realized how much effort you put into this." My mother added, "We see you now. Your perspective matters." These words, delivered without dramatics or condescension, carried the weight of years of recognition denied. I felt a wave of relief and quiet triumph, a deep emotional validation that went beyond praise. It was acceptance, understanding, and respect. My sister, too, had changed. The subtle defensiveness, the calculated manipulations, and the occasional attempts to undermine my authority had largely disappeared. She no longer sought to dominate every conversation, and while rivalry still existed, it had shifted into a healthier dynamic of mutual recognition. The contrast was striking. The sister who had once overshadowed and belittled now coexisted with me on a more balanced plane, her presence no longer a source of insecurity or humiliation. The emotional payoff extended beyond recognition. I felt a profound sense of belonging, a realization that my efforts, voice, and achievements had permanently shifted the household dynamic. Where betrayal, favoritism, and neglect had once defined my family interactions, respect, acknowledgement, and equitable consideration now prevailed. The tension that had defined years of my life was replaced by calm confidence, a deep sense of justice, and an internal assurance that I was seen for who I truly was. The process had not been about vengeance. I did not need to orchestrate dramatic payback or public humiliation to achieve closure. Instead, the catharsis came through quiet empowerment, the patient accumulation of competence, and the strategic assertion of self-worth. Every subtle victory, every acknowledged achievement, every calm assertion, and every demonstration of resilience added to a cumulative sense of fulfillment that could not be taken away. I remember one moment that crystallized the catharsis. We were having dinner, and the conversation naturally turned to past family projects and accomplishments. My sister, without hesitation, deferred to my judgment on a complex matter, recognizing my insight openly. My parents nodded in agreement, listening carefully to my suggestions. It was a simple, ordinary interaction, yet it carried the emotional weight of years of struggle, humiliation, and quiet observation. I realized that the power dynamic had permanently shifted, not through anger or resentment, but through the assertion of competence, patience, and self-respect. In that moment, the contrast between past and present could not have been clearer. The same house that had once amplified favoritism and exclusion now witnessed my authority and presence. Betrayal and neglect had given way to respect and acknowledgement. Humiliation had been replaced by calm, undeniable empowerment. It was a profound emotional payoff, an experience of justice that was not externalized in conflict, but internalized as personal growth and fulfillment. This cathartic moment also carried a sense of liberation. I no longer measured my worth against my sister's successes or my parents' approval. I understood that true empowerment is an internal process, cultivated through resilience, reflection, and deliberate action. External recognition was now a reinforcement of the strength I had already internalized. I felt free from the invisible chains of favoritism, manipulation, and marginalization that had constrained me for so long. The broader lesson, I realized, was universal. Many of us navigate spaces where favoritism, neglect, or betrayal shape our experiences. The path to empowerment is rarely about revenge or retaliation. It is about cultivating self-respect, asserting boundaries, and claiming presence with dignity. The cathartic payoff comes when the internal and external worlds align, when personal growth intersects with acknowledgement, and when the energy that once fueled resentment is transformed into strength and fulfillment. As the family dynamic settled, Into this new equilibrium, I felt a profound sense of peace. I could participate fully, assert my voice without fear, and enjoy the recognition that had long been withheld. The tension, anxiety, and subtle competition that had dominated years of my life were replaced by a quieter, deeper satisfaction. The knowledge that I had navigated the storm, claimed my space, and emerged whole, respected, and empowered. The contrast framing was undeniable. Where once there was exclusion, there was now belonging. Where betrayal had eroded confidence, recognition restored it. Where humiliation had defined interactions, calm authority now prevailed. And through it all, the journey reinforced that empowerment is not about diminishing others, but about elevating oneself, quietly, steadily, and with enduring strength. Finally, as I reflected on the path I had traveled, I felt a deep sense of emotional closure. The years of struggle, observation, confrontation, and strategic assertion had culminated in a lasting transformation. I had reclaimed my voice, established my authority, and found peace within the household that had once constrained me. The journey had been long, difficult, and emotionally charged, but the payoff was worth every challenge, every moment of doubt, and every struggle for recognition. If you related to my story, subscribe to my channel for more real-life stories of family, betrayal, revenge, and empowerment.